All right, y'all may be seated. Kevin is our speaker tonight, and I really enjoyed this afternoon getting to talk to him. And I hesitate to say some of these things about him because high expectations create high disappointment. But he is a best-selling author. He really is. He has written a book that's on Amazon. You can go buy it. And when it premiered as a bestseller. You see, that's what I want to do one day is write a book, and he's already done that. So Kevin, coming up and share with us today, brother. He's going to tell a little bit more about his story, some of the other things that he's done. I'll save that for him and let him share that with you. But really a neat guy. I've enjoyed getting to know him. Kevin, brother, God bless you.
All right, well, thank you.
I'll hand it over to you. Take it and go.
All right, here we go. Well, good evening. Thanks for being here tonight, and I'm excited about what we're going to talk about. And I just want to tell you a little bit about my story and where that all came from. I did write a book, which is weird, and didn't think I'd ever do that. And there's been a few things that have happened over the last few years in our lives. And Marie and I, we've been in ministry since I was 18 years old. When I was 18 years old, I went to college to be a business major because I was determined that I would not be a pastor. Like, I was determined. And I told God straight up, I will never be a pastor. And the good news is Marie also told God that she would never marry a pastor. And so we both showed him. We are proving him wrong. And so we both decided these things. I went to school to be a business major, do marketing, and I was in school for that. But as soon as I showed up at school, there was a church that approached me and said, would you come and be a youth pastor at our church? And I was 18 years old. I was like literally 6 months older than the oldest kid in the youth group. It was the blind leading the blind. It was not a good idea. I would never recommend this. But that's what happened, and so I went and worked with these students. As I was in college, I kind of started to feel this call on my life in ministry. There was one night Marie and I were riding in the car together, leaving from a student event, and she was like, "Hey, Kevin, I don't know if you ever feel this, but when I hear you talk about the classes you're taking in business and in marketing and stuff," she said, "you're really not interested in that. It's like you just hate it. But when you talk about doing this ministry stuff, it's like you come alive. Like you're just excited, and you seem to love it." And she was like, "Have you ever thought about doing ministry?" And I was like, "Well, I thought you wouldn't marry a pastor." And she said, "Well, I thought you weren't going to be a pastor." And I was like, "Well, fair enough." And so we prayed about it and felt this call in my life and felt like that was something I was supposed to do. So from there on, we started working in churches from the time I was 18 until now. I mean, I've been doing this for 17 years, guys. I'm old. I've been doing this for 17 years. We've moved across the country. I was working in Virginia Beach. I worked in Washington State, north of Seattle, and then came back to Florida. And we were in Florida a couple years ago. We were at a church there, and I was a creative arts pastor. I used to tour in a band and do, I used to gig all over the country and do that kind of thing. So I've been in worship most of my life. And I was at a church as a creative arts pastor, and things were just kind of bumpy at the church. And our state pastor in the Church of God there called me and said, "Hey, Kevin, can we meet with you?" And so we had a little meeting. We sat down together, and he said, "Kevin, have you ever thought about planting a church?" He said, "I think that might be something you're called to do." And he said, "Is that something you'd be interested in?" And I said, "Absolutely not. No, I have no desire to plant a church. That sounds real hard. That sounds difficult. I don't think that's for me." And he said, "Well, Kevin, I think you might want to pray about it." So we did. We prayed about it. And about 3 years ago, God told us that we were going to plant a church. And I've started to find this pattern in my life where I'm very reluctant to what God says, and then he makes me do it anyways. I don't know if you ever feel this way. It's a lot of fun. It's a great way to live. And so we planted this church. We started this church in Trinity, Florida, which was an area north of Tampa. And Trinity is a growing area. It sounds very spiritual because it's called Trinity. It's not necessarily as spiritual as it sounds. There's a lot of people there that are hurting, a lot of people that are lost, a lot of people broken right now. And so we moved there, and it's an area that's a little bit more affluent, which, in my opinion, can become actually one of the more difficult places to do ministry. When people don't have need, they don't think they need a God. That's just as simple as it sounds. And so we kind of ran into that. So while I was planting the church, I had never preached on a weekly basis. That was a new thing for me. And I hadn't actually had to preach. I had to go stand in front of churches of thousands of people and play guitar and sing songs, but I'd never preached on a weekly basis. So there was a guy in our church when we were first launching. He was a part of a group called Toastmasters. I don't know if you've ever heard of Toastmasters. Toastmasters is a speaking organization. It's not Christian. It's a business speaking organization. And he said, "Kevin, you should go to this with me if you want to learn how to speak better." And I thought that'd be a good idea. So I showed up to a Toastmasters event one night. It was a little club in our area. There were about 40 people in the room, and they had everybody kind of do their little speeches, and everybody had to speak. And there came a point where I got up and I spoke. And they were like, you should do this more. You should come back more. So I came back one more week, and the next week I did a speech in front of everybody. And as I was looking around the room, I was thinking, there's atheists in this room, there's agnostics in this room, there's Hindus in this room, there's Buddhists in this room. This is a room I need to be in every week. I need to put this on my calendar because I believe personally that Jesus would make room on his calendar for events like this. Sometimes what happens when we get into ministry, especially, is we insulate ourselves, we isolate ourselves, and we are no longer in touch with our community. We're just involved with the people who go to our church, and there's a big difference between those two things, right? So I started going back to the Toastmasters Club. I started speaking a little bit more, and I did another speech, and a guy came up to me afterwards. He's an atheist. His name's Jim, and Jim came up to me and he said, Kevin, you should compete in speaking. You should do that speech again and compete. And I was like, that's funny, Jim, because you can't compete in speaking. It's an art form. You can't say one person's better than another. And he was like, no, you can actually. We have a competition. He said, and if you win, we will fly you out to Vancouver, British Columbia. And I have a lot of friends out there. And I was thinking, okay, well, if I win, then I just get a free trip to go see my friends. That sounds like a bargain. And so I really wasn't thinking much beyond that. That was my whole plan, was I'm just going to go speak. I'm going to win a competition. Then I'm going to go see some friends in British Columbia. That was my plan. So I spoke through all these districts, I spoke through all these different divisions and all these different things, hundreds of people competing, and I ended up winning our division, I won our district, and then I got sent out to British Columbia. What I didn't realize was I was in the top 100 speakers out of 60,000 competitors all over the world. I had no idea 60,000 people were competing for this. I didn't know this was a big deal. I was honestly probably undervaluing the experience I was having. And so I show up there, there's 100 speakers left. You speak in a heat of 10 people. The 10 people I was competing against, of that 10 people, 4 people had done TED Talks. And I'm not talking TEDx, I'm talking like TED Talks. 4 of those people. One of them was the COO of Google at the moment. And I was like, well, I'm a church planner. No big deal. And so, I mean, I'm looking at these people. They're professional speakers from all over the world. I ended up winning out of those top 10. I got to the number 1 spot of those 10, which sent me to the final 10. I'm now in the final 10 of 60,000 people who had competed in this, with over 300,000 people worldwide watching this. And so they're simulcasting this all over the world, and I get on a stage with 10 people to compete for the number 1 spot in the world. I ended up that night getting 3rd in the world and 1st in America. I am still to this day considered the best speaker in America, which is a weird thing and really terrifying. And it makes expectations very high when you're preaching with that title, because you're never going to live up to it. And so what happened was, as this happened, people all over the world started to watch what I was doing. They started to pay attention to what I was speaking about. Now, they didn't care that I was talking about Jesus. They just cared that I was speaking. They were interested in the art of speaking. So the people would show up to our church, they would show up to events I was doing, and I would warn them like, hey, I'm going to talk about Jesus, and they'd be like, that's cool, I'm just here to hear you speak. But then what happens is people start sticking. They start coming to church every week because they want to hear you speak, but you're speaking about Jesus. And my opinion is, it doesn't matter how good of a speaker I am to hook you in. I believe Jesus is going to hook you in. And so we keep talking about Jesus, and people keep showing up. And so our church, our small little baby church, is turning into a church of Buddhists, of people of different faiths, of atheists and agnostics throughout our church. Like, it was crazy. For a church that was our size, to have so many different faiths represented, so many people of different backgrounds and different walks, was fascinating. And the problem became, we didn't know how to really handle this. Like, I don't know if you've ever been in a spot like this, but we were like there came a moment, and for the first time in my life, where I started praying that Christians would come to our church. I was like, God, just send us a couple Christians, because I can't disciple all these people by myself. Like, just give me a couple people who know you and kind of follow after you and could disciple more people. Never thought I would do that in my life. We actually started praying that Christians would show up, and they did. We got some people in there that could start discipling other people. But it was this problem, and what we were running into is there were 2 sides. There were 2 sides in our culture that we were running into, and I don't know if you experience this here. I'm going to guess that Alabama is no different than the rest of our country right now. But there's 2 polarizing sides that are happening at all times in our country, in our nation, in our kingdoms, in our empires of this world. There's 2 sides that are going to drag us apart, and there's the side that is this overly progressive, whatever word you want to use for it. This side that is saying it's okay, and whatever comes your way is what you're going to go with. And it says just go along with it and just assimilate to all the culture. Do what everybody else is doing and act like everybody else is acting. Right? Anybody else feel that tug? It's happening in our world all the time. And on the other side, there's this very conservative, strict religious system that has held on to us for a very, very long time. There's a draw, there's a pull, there's a tug that we have to become separatists. We have to either assimilate to the culture or separate to our religion. Does that make sense? It feels like everything pulls us in one of two ways. Like we're either pulled into the mainstream of our culture or we're pulled away into this like really strict, crazy religious thing that says we have to separate and leave all the culture behind and just go into seclusion and start making our own clothes again out of curtains and wear bonnets or whatever and start doing this again because otherwise we're going to be too close to the culture and we're going to look like them. Right? Does anybody else feel this tension? Right now in America, I think it's more polarizing than it's ever been in this way. That there's two sides and they're kind of warring against one another because we can't figure out where we fall in the midst of these things. And if you look at the cultures right now in the UK, we were just in the UK a few months ago, and I mean it's terrifying to be over throughout the UK because right now churches are just done. Churches have no life in them. People do not go to church. They are not following Jesus. They live in a fully post-Christian society. And most scholars believe that where we're at right now in America is only about 30 years behind where they are right now, that we're moving that way too. While some people would be fearful of that, and would be like, uh-oh, this is bad for us. We should bow up, we should start fighting, whatever. I actually kind of have this opinion where I think that might be okay. Because if you pay attention to the Bible, the church of Jesus has always done its best work when it's under oppression. It's always done its best work. Why? Because we have to ask ourselves the questions of why are we doing this? Why are you here tonight? Why do we give money to a church? Why do we worship Jesus? Because we have to start asking those questions again. It's not just a country club. It's something we have to figure out for ourselves. But we get polarized in these ways. We get pulled from one side to the other. It's very hard to label. And so for us, we had to figure out what was a terminology we could use for all of us to understand. And not religious and not cultural, but something different. We couldn't use religious terms in our church because people were very turned off to that. But we also couldn't use these cultural terms saying everything's fine because that's not the way of Jesus either. So we used this term, the way of Jesus. We came up with this idea of this is the way of Jesus. Early followers of Jesus, they did not call themselves Christians. That was a term that was given to them. It was not a term they ever talked about for themselves. Christians was a term that was given in the church of Galatia because in Galatia, there were people coming in that were Jews, people that were Gentiles. They were like, what do we call this? And the outsiders started calling them Christians, which means little Christs. They were little Christs, and they were in this church together, but that's where the term Christian came from. It was never something they called themselves. In fact, most of the early followers of Jesus called it the way. What they followed was the way of Jesus. So we had to find this middle ground. That's actually what the lab is about, and so we wrote that for our church, saying, how can we learn the way of Jesus? How can we study that for 7 weeks in our church? People from all different faiths, all different backgrounds, going through the way of Jesus and learning that together. We did that in our church for 7 weeks, and after it was done, a publisher got a hold of it, called me and said, I think we can do something with this, and it launched last Friday on Amazon, and it was a bestseller, which is real weird. So we're talking about this way of Jesus. What I want to do tonight is I want to look at that because we get so polarized, one side or the other, like we talked about this morning. There's one side or the other. The world wants us to categorize things, and categorizing things is very hard because we're talking about earthly categorizations, which is very difficult when you're talking about a heavenly kingdom. The kingdom of Jesus does not just exist inside of our little bounds and our little terms, right? It's going to be really hard to understand that. My son, we were talking about categories the other day. He was trying to understand some things. He just turned 7, and he was going through some things, and he said, so now, Dad, when girls grow up, they become women, right? And I was like, yeah, girls become women. And boys become men, right? Yeah, Oliver, boys become men. He was trying to figure all this out. Like, so what's the terminology? He said, so when boys grow up, they can become uncles, right? Yeah, boys would be uncles, and girls would be aunts. Yeah, girls would be aunts. And we were kind of going through this whole thing. So boys grow up, they'd be grandpas, and girls would be grandmas. And finally he said, so when girls grow up, they become wives, and when boys grow up, they become Kevins. I was like, well, some of them do. I mean, not all of them. Just I did, mostly, that you know of. And it's hard to categorize things. It's hard to put these things in categories. But what I want to talk about tonight is this way of not putting us on one side or the other. It's not about being progressive or conservative. It's not about being right or wrong. It's not about which side of the aisle you're on. It's not about those things. The way of Jesus is something wholly and completely different. It's a third way. It's not just a hybrid of the two. It is something completely new that the world has never seen before and will never see again. And if you and I will subscribe to it, I believe it will change our lives. It will change the people around us. It will change our country. It will change our communities. But we have to figure out this way of Jesus. So I want to look at just like a few passages real quick, okay? There's a few passages I just want to walk through, and I want us to look at through the lens of what Jesus was experiencing. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to start in verse 38. Now, this is during kind of the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, some of his most famous teachings. And what we need to understand real quick before we go into this is we need to understand that Jesus lived in ancient Rome. This is highly important. We forget sometimes that Jesus lived in like a real community and a real culture and a real country with real problems. And what was happening, this does not make this less relevant, by the way. To understand what Rome was doing makes it more relevant because this is much more similar to the world we live in right now. In Rome, that was a huge kingdom. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. To this day, you and I, our thinking is still more influenced by the people of Rome than it's been influenced by anybody else. We still think along the lines of Roman philosophers more than we ever thought we could. I mean, it's still amazing how much their culture influenced our culture today. But this kingdom was massive. It was a huge kingdom, and there were two sides to the kingdom. There was the culture, this progressive Roman culture saying you need to be part of this, or there was the religious establishment, the Hebrew culture, the Jewish culture that had been there for hundreds of years and now had its own following. And there was this way between them. If you pay attention to what Jesus did, he found a tension, he found a place between the two where he never fully sided with one or the other. He never fully sided with Rome, but he also never fully sided with the religious establishment. In fact, Jesus was very against religion. There's a part of me that believes if Jesus was like right here today and we told Jesus like, hey, Jesus, we made a religion in your name. Don't worry, we made a religion and we have like lots of churches. They're all different kinds and they all have different names. And we even started to number some of them. There's like first ones and second ones. We have all these different religion like things for you. Wouldn't you be happy about that? I believe that Jesus would be like, no, you missed it. Didn't you hear me about religion? Like he hated religion. He was not here for more religion. And so Jesus never fully sided on one side or the other. He did something wholly new. And this happened in the midst of one of the most progressive cultures the world has ever seen, but also one of the most strict religious cultures that the world has ever seen. And he's right in the tension of these two things. And so in Matthew chapter 5, what we see is there's this moment where he starts to teach. And he has this moment on the mountain where he starts to teach his people. And this is what he says. He comes out of the gates pretty hot with this. You've probably heard these verses before, but we're going to kind of break this down for a second. So it says in Matthew chapter 5, 38, it says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Okay? You've heard this saying before. I'm sure you guys have heard it before. This isn't a new saying to you either. This wasn't even a new saying to Jesus. This saying does show up in the Bible. 4 different times in the Old Testament, you can find this exact saying. This is a biblical statement, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So the religious people were on board with this. But also, the culture was on board with this idea. Because in about the 16th century BC, there was a guy named Hammurabi. He was the emperor of Babylon at the time, and he adopted this phrase for Babylon. And he was also very invested in this. He loved the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So both the culture and the religion had started to buy into this idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus then, he doesn't show us that you have to choose one way or the other. He does something wholly new. This is what it says right after that. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Don't resist them. Don't run away from it. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now, I'm going to look at it real quick in the ESV, but what it says right here in the ESV, it says, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if someone, specifically in the ESV, this is a better translation, it says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now, this is very specific. Jesus' words here are very important. Here's what we know about the culture. I was recently speaking in Dubai, and there's still truth to this in the Middle East. What we know about the culture of Jesus' day is they would only use one hand for most things. The other hand, if you're familiar with Middle Eastern culture, was used for sanitary purposes. It was for going to the restroom. That's what this hand was for. You did not use this hand for other things. This hand would essentially be off limits. So you only had one hand to use. It's very specific what's being said here, because then it says that if someone slaps you. See, in Jesus' day, there was a hierarchy of hitting, which is weird. But there were different ways to hit someone. Slapping would have been seen as an insult. You would slap someone who was less than you. So if you had a slave, you would slap them because they weren't as good as you. It was just an insult. It wasn't necessarily to hurt them. It was to put them in their place. You have slapped them, and now you've put them back where they belong. And so what we understand is that they would slap people to insult, to put them back down. But Jesus says that they're going to slap you on the right cheek, and then he says, so turn to them the other as well. Now, you would slap with the back of your hand. It was this motion right here. This is an official slap with the back of your hand. I'm sure that it feels like you take off like your riding gloves first and then you slap. But it's this thing right here. It's with the back of your hand. That's how you slapped. You didn't slap with the front of your hand. You slapped with the back. But then there was another kind of hit. And the bigger hit was the punch, right? You could punch someone. Now, a punch is right on, and you're going to come at them with this, again, with one hand. You only have one hand. Now, punches were reserved for people who were equal to you. You didn't punch somebody lesser than you. You punched somebody who was an equal to you, showing them that you were now in a fight with them. They were on your level. You weren't going to waste your time fighting with somebody less than you. You would punch somebody who was equal to you. We know this. This is actually documented throughout some Roman history of how this worked. Now, what Jesus is saying is actually brilliant here. What he's saying, this third way that he's showing us, is brilliant. Because, yes, he's saying you need to humble yourself, but there's something more to it. So, if we can try to play this out for just a second, if we can do this. Actually, Maddie, can you come up here real quick? Can you come do this for me real quick? Is that okay? Can I get Allison? Is Allison here? I'll take her. Can Allison do it for me? I was going to get somebody. I wanted to make other people do this, but this is my cousin, and this is going to be ugly, guys. I'm just going to warn you. This is a family feud, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you, so you're going to have one hand behind your back. I want you to put your left hand behind your back, okay? Now, if you slap me, go ahead and slap me. Show me how that works. This is stage acting, guys. Don't worry, she did not actually make contact. It was just really good, wasn't it? It felt good. You're all like, wow, that was intense. Okay, so this is a slap. Show me the slap one more time. So that is on the right cheek. Notice how Jesus even said on the right cheek. But then what does he say after that? He says, but then turn to them your other cheek as well. Now, if I turn my other cheek, how could you slap me this way? Is there any way to slap me that way with the back of your hand? Yeah, it's not comfortable, is it? It's not going to be a good slap. This is going to be bad. So what would you have to do? How would you have to hit me? You'd have to use your other hand. Now let's say you don't have that hand to use. What kind of hit would you have to do? You'd have to punch me. So show me what that looks like. Because you only have one hand. Oh, that was good. Wow. Okay. So sorry you had to see that. You had to witness that violence. But do you see what just happened? By turning the other cheek, he's saying you just made yourself an equal with that person. You've made them choose. You've made them have to make a choice. Either they make you an equal with them, or they don't hit you. You made them make this choice by humbling yourself. Does that make sense? You've lowered yourself, and by doing so, you have raised yourself to their level. This is the way of Jesus. This is what's different about this. Thank you, Allison. You did great, by the way. That was fantastic. Really good. Guys, I'm going to be honest with you. We didn't even practice that. We didn't even try before this moment. So Allison's like a pro. So that's what Jesus is saying. Do you understand what he's saying? This is brilliant. This is brilliant. When you are in that moment with your coworker, where they are oppressing or they feel like they're coming at you, when you're in that moment with your parents where it feels like they're coming at you, where you're in that moment with the people that you come in contact with every single day that feel like they are coming at you and they are oppressing, they are pushing down on you, what Jesus is saying is if you lower yourself, if you choose this way of humility, it's not fight or flight, which is what we're so used to. It's something else. You haven't fought them and you haven't run away from them. What you've done is you've lowered yourself, and by lowering yourself, you've made them make the choice. You've made them make the choice of, are they going to make you an equal to them? Or are you going to be safe and they're going to stop doing what they've done? The way of Jesus is a third way. It's not just a hybrid of the other two ways. It's a complete third way. And Jesus isn't done. If we keep going, it gets better here. So the second thing that he says right after that, he says, and if someone wants to take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone wants to take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Now, in this day and age, the Jews were actually in a spot, Jesus is talking probably mostly to Jews, the Jews were in such an oppressive place that actually it's believed that they were being taxed at 90% of their income. They had what was called triple taxation. And so they paid taxes to 3 different entities at the same time. They would pay taxes to Caesar, they would pay the Herodian tax, which was their state tax, and then they would pay taxes to the temple as well. The temple actually was one of the most oppressive places. They took the most money from their own people. To this day, the Sanhedrin and the group that you probably see, the Sadducees in the Bible, if you see them a lot, the Sadducees were a group that was taking the temple tax. And actually, we just recently, there was excavation found of Sadducees' homes. And in the Sadducees' homes, they had bottles of wine that in their own day would have cost thousands of dollars per bottle. And these were temple officials. They were oppressing their own people, taking so much tax from their own people. And it's believed that Jews in this day and age were only keeping 10% of their income total. Like if you think our taxes are bad in America, this is the worst case scenario. 90% of your income going back out. They were as highly oppressed as ever. And what was happening was wealthy people were swooping in and they were buying up land, and then they were making the poor people pay them more money for this land. I know this doesn't sound anything like a country you could imagine, but just imagine a world where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poor. Just try to put yourself in an imaginary world where that's happening. I know that doesn't happen here, but just pretend like that was possible. That there were people coming in and were actually getting wealthier and wealthier based on what they were charging the poorer and poorer people. And this is happening more and more. And so in this day and age, it was not uncommon for you to actually be sued. If you could not pay the wealthy person who owned your house, a Jew could be taken to court. And they could be taken to court and they could literally be sued for their garments. The whole idea of a shirt off your back is not a new thing. They literally could be sued for the shirt on their back. And so they would be taken into court. And what Jesus is saying right here is he says, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, well, let him have your cloak as well. Now, your tunic was this garment that actually the word means against your skin. It was your undergarments. I kind of hope that you still use those. But then the cloak was the thing over it. The cloak was the part over it. And he says, if anybody comes in to try to take your tunic, he actually says, then that's okay, but let him have your robe as well. There's a reason he says this. In the Hebrew culture, there was this idea that at this moment, that shame of nakedness, there was a nakedness and a shame, but if you were naked and seen in public, the shame was not on the person who was naked. The shame was on the person who looked at the person who was naked. So in Genesis, we see this. This happens with Noah. Noah is naked at one point. His sons get cursed for seeing him naked. We see it with David. David is the one who the shame is on because he sees Bathsheba. The shame is not on her. The shame is on him. This happens throughout the Hebrew culture. And at this time, what Jesus is saying is actually if they come in and they want to sue you and take everything you have, and they take the tunic, the part right up against your skin, he says actually give it to them, and then go ahead and just start the and start to give them that cloak too. Why? Because the shame will not be on you. The shame is on them, and you're making them make a choice because they may have to say, yes, give me that, and now I am the one that bears the shame. Or they may have to say, you know what, forget it. Just keep it. And Jesus is saying, by lowering yourself, by showing more humility, you actually have raised yourself again. This is the third way of Jesus. He's not in either camp. He's something completely different. The last thing he says is he goes into this last bit where he says, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. This, again, sounds very simple. If someone makes you go 1 mile with them, go 2 miles. Now, this was a Roman law. What we know is that there was a pax angrea. The pax angrea was a law of the Roman soldiers. A soldier could come to you at any time if you were just out playing with your family, if you were out walking to the temple, if you were out going to work. A soldier could walk up to you any time from the Roman army, and they could say, I want you to carry my gear. I want you to carry all of my stuff for 1 mile. Now, in the Roman world, it was 1,000 steps was considered a mile, a milas. It was 1,000 steps, which would be about 1,600 yards roughly. But it was this big step that you would take. And as you took these 1,000 steps, you would then be counting literally every single step as you walked with this soldier. You'd have their gear on you, and they could do this at any time they wanted. It did not matter what you were in the middle of. A soldier could come up to you and say, take my stuff and walk 1 mile with me. Walk 1,000 steps. Now, we know a couple things about Rome. One is that they were not a very forgiving culture. If they had a law, they stuck to the law. And what Jesus is saying is, walk that 1,000 steps with them. Go ahead and fulfill what they've asked you to do. But the moment you get to step 1001, go ahead and take that step too. Because who's going to be in trouble for this? Who's going to be the one that bears the problems and the shame from this? Rome isn't going to be happy about one of their soldiers breaking their own laws. You've just lowered yourself. And by lowering yourself, by humbling yourself, you have raised yourself up again. Do you understand the way of Jesus? It's something different. And when you lower yourself, when you humble yourself even more, there's a third way. It's not one or the other. It's a third way where you're acting different. And in acting in humility in the way that Jesus calls us to, we actually find a new path in the culture that we've been placed in. We don't have to stay within the confines. We don't have to choose one side or the other. That's not the issue. We choose Jesus instead of choosing a side. We choose his humility. We choose his example. When we choose his example, we don't have to worry about polarization of sides. He says, do these things, and suddenly everything changes when you humble yourself in this way. Now, Jesus models this for us, doesn't he? Jesus is the one who gives us this example. We see it in Philippians where it says that Jesus was one who came from the throne of God, but he did not see equality with God as something to be grasped. Instead, he humbled himself and made himself a servant. He became a servant. He lowered himself, and in lowering himself, it then says he was exalted to the highest place. If you and I are going to follow in Jesus' footsteps, if we're going to follow the way of Jesus, we have to learn this humility where we lower ourselves, and in doing so, we allow God to exalt us. It's a backwards thing. It's so counterintuitive to the world we live in. A few years ago, I was in San Francisco with a group of students, and I was doing student ministry at the time. We had high school students, and we took about 30 students down to San Francisco. And we were working in the inner city. Now, if you know anything about San Francisco, the city is a 7 mile by 7 mile square. It's like a perfect square. It's very small. And so the rent and the cost of living in this small little area gets very, very high. They have one of the largest financial institutions in America, and they have a lot of tech industry. So it's a very expensive area because it's so small. And so people were moving in, and they could barely afford to live. There were literally people we met almost every day who were working full-time jobs, good jobs, and could barely afford to live there. In fact, many people we knew worked full-time jobs, then they would sleep in what was called a single-room occupancy, which was just a hotel room that you could rent by the week. And they would stay in that room for 1 week, then they would run out of money, and the next week they would go back onto the street, then the next week they would stay in a room again, then they would go back on the street. These are people working full-time jobs. And they could barely afford to stay on the street. It was crazy. It was in 2010, so it was right after the recession. We saw families that looked just like my family that were walking into soup kitchens and could barely make ends meet. And we were working in San Francisco for a few days, and it was heartbreaking and it was gut-wrenching. And there came a moment where we were walking into a park down by the water, and there was this big bay, and there were seals and all that kind of stuff. And I had a group of guys with me, and we had made some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. We were pretty impressed with ourselves. And so we brought these peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in little bags, and we were going to hand them out to all these homeless people in the park. So my guys, they split up and they start going different places, and they start handing out these bags, and they're handing out these peanut butter and jelly bags. And it was amazing watching these homeless people that would open up these bags, and they'd look at the peanut butter and jelly and be like, oh, okay. And someone would eat them, and they were fine, and they were nice. But there came one moment where one of our guys, he was a junior at the time, his name was Alex, and Alex walked up to a guy, and he gave him this bag, and he said, hey, we made these peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for you. And the guy took the bag, and he looked at Alex, and he said, I appreciate this, and this is fine that you made this for us, but I don't know if you can see, but my friend here doesn't have any shoes. Like, he doesn't have any shoes on. And so this is nice, and it's fine that you fed us for like a minute, but he doesn't have any shoes, and it's cold out here, and his feet are starting to like turn blue, and he needs shoes. He doesn't really need a peanut butter jelly sandwich. And so they started kind of this back and forth, and Alex was like, but we made you peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Like, that's all we had. We made those, and that's what we could do. And the guy was like, no, I'm telling you, he needs shoes. Why doesn't he have shoes? You should have brought shoes down here. And I'm across the way in the park, and I start to hear this commotion kind of starting to pick up over in this side of the park. And so I walk over as the experienced youth pastor who knows how to mediate these things. I'm like 25. And I'm like, yeah, let's talk about this. And so I'm listening to them, and this guy just starts getting more escalated and more escalated. Eventually he's yelling at Alex. He's yelling at him, telling him, you should have brought shoes. My friend needs shoes. He doesn't need your sandwiches. He needs shoes. That's more important. I don't want your sandwich. I don't care about your sandwich. This guy needs shoes. And I started to like get angry. Like, there was a part of me that was like starting to get mad. Like, well, we did what we could do, and we did something good, and you should just be happy about the thing we brought you. Just deal with it. Like, we did something, and other people didn't do anything, and we're like, this is good, right? We did something. And as I start to get heated, I start to talk to the man, and I start to like get a little bit agitated, I start to get angry. I look over, and I kid you not, Alex is taking off his shoes. He's untying his own shoes. We left the park that day, and Alex walked out barefoot. And that day, Alex had humbled himself. And he had lived the way of Jesus, and he could walk out of that park with his head high. To be honest, I couldn't. He had learned what it meant to humble himself, to continue to humble himself, and in doing so, just keep humbling himself. Just keep lowering himself to the point where he did what was right, and I didn't. Guys, I don't care which side of the world you sit on, if you're on the unrighteous or the self-righteous, we don't live in a world that tells you to humble yourself that way. There's only one person who does. There's this Jesus who says that you humble yourself this low, and in doing so, you allow God to be the one who exalts you to the place you should be at. That God will take care of that he will bring the things to you that you need, but it only comes through humbling yourself. It's not through aligning yourself with one side or the other. It's not through being just a mainstream, I'm a part of the culture. It's not through being so religious that you've lost your relationship with Jesus. But it's something in between, and it's finding this middle ground that Jesus says is humbling yourself above all things. I hope that we can learn from this way of Jesus. See, we want to be either or. We want to try to do these things. In Galatians, there's a verse where Paul is kind of writing to people, and he's kind of saying, you've tried to be both these things. You've tried so hard to make sense out of both these things. But he says, for all of you who are baptized in Christ, you've clothed yourself with Christ. And from there he says, so there is neither Greek, there's no Jews, there's no Gentiles. And so you would think, well, then if we're not Jews, then we must be Gentiles. No, there's neither one. Or there's no slaves nor free. Well, we must be the slaves. If we're not the slaves, then we must be the free. Nope, there's neither one. There's neither male nor there's female. If I'm not the male, I must be the female. No, there's neither one. All of you, all of us are one, not through who? Through Christ Jesus. We're not on one side or the other. We're something completely different. I believe we have a world around us who's looking for people who will live in that. I believe there's a world around us who's looking for people who aren't going to just go along with everything. They're not just going to assimilate. And I also believe we have a world of people who are looking for people who aren't just going to separate, but they're looking for people who can live something different right in the midst of the moment that we're in. And I hope it's you. I hope that whether it's in your school or it's in your job or it's in your family, that you don't feel like you have to just go along, but you don't have to go against. And you find this way to live that is just the way that Jesus lived in between the two. Something wholly unique, something wholly different. So I appreciate you letting me share with you tonight. Tonight I'm just going to pray for us, and the band's going to come up and close us tonight. My hope is that through this week and through these next few days that you find places where maybe you think that it's all one or it's all the other, but maybe there's moments where you start to find this in-between ground. This moment where you find what Jesus' way is, and you ditch the relationship, you ditch the culture, and you just look for this relationship with Jesus. So I want to pray for us as we get ready to sing, and then we'll close together. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you for your example. I thank you for your teaching that's just different. It's really unlike anything that our world has ever seen, but it's something that our world desperately needs. And Jesus, I pray that we would be bold enough. We'd be wise enough. We'd be intentional enough to follow your way. Even when things are difficult. Pray that there'd be moments where it may feel like we have to just go along, but we wouldn't just go along with the culture. There'll be moments where it feels like we have to go against the culture. And I pray we wouldn't just go against everything that stands, but that you would teach us that there's something else that you have for us. That your kingdom does not exist on this earth, and we should stop acting like it's here. That it's in these moments that we wouldn't just look at the things around us and say, well, it must be like this or like that. No. That your kingdom is something wholly different. I do believe that your kingdom can be seen. I believe that your kingdom is in our midst. I believe it can be felt and it can be followed right now. But it's something completely different than what this world has to offer. So I pray you take us away from the moments where we want to submit to earthly kings, where we want to submit to earthly kingdoms, that we would fix our eyes on a heavenly king and a heavenly kingdom. We would live a completely different way, which is the way of your Son. Praise sings your name. Amen.